drawing faces is arguably the hardest part of making art, which is why I kinda suck at it. So I decided to spend a total of 100 hours testing a large variety of proven methods to help improve my ability to draw better faces. And finally I'll put everything I've learned during the 100 hours into my own face illustration, while sharing all the powerful techniques I've learned during the challenge to help you all draw amazing anime-style faces too. But going into it, I realized that I didn't really have a clear plan laid out for these 100 hours. So I decided that it would probably be best to spend around the first 10 hours of this challenge just practicing the core fundamentals of construction. So I went over to ArtStation to find a good Asaro Head 3D model to practice drawing the different planes of the face in perspective. I started by drawing one from a head-on perspective, but I quickly realized that I didn't really have a solid construction method for drawing them, which meant I ended up kinda just trying to recreate the reference instead of trying to truly understand how it fundamentally worked yet. Afterwards, I also tried drawing some different angles of the Asaro Head, trying to understand the logic of the perspective a little bit more. And honestly, the defined and chiseled edges of the Asaro Head really helped me get a better understanding of how to draw heads in perspective, since you'd actually have to clearly draw out and understand every plane of the head and face, as well as how they shift when using a different perspective. But going directly to studying the Asaro Head might have been a little extreme, so I went over to something a little simpler that I've surprisingly enough more or less never done in my art journey, which is just drawing plain old boxes in perspective. Yep, this is probably one of the most important fundamentals of art and I've just completely skipped out of it until now. But finally getting some reps in definitely helped me internalize how geometrical shape changes as you gradually shift the camera perspective. After drawing a good amount of boxes, I decided to move on to something a little more applicable to drawing cute anime girls, which was trying to figure out how the Loomis Method works. So for those of you who don't know what the Loomis Method is yet, it's more or less one of the most popular head construction methods out there that tries to simplify the head into simpler to understand shapes and guidelines. So for my understanding of the Loomis Method, you start by drawing a circle that you make three-dimensional by drawing curved lines around it. From there on, you'll have to cut around 1/3 of the side of the sphere by drawing in another circle, which is something we do since the sides of the heads are relatively flat and not spherical like you can clearly see here on the Asaro Head. After you have a nice little ball, you'll have to continue a line down the center of the ball to the bottom of what is going to become the jaw. And now all that remains is just connecting the sides of the jaw together, keeping in mind the general shapes as defined back on the Asaro Head. Now we finally just have to add an ear, and that's more or less the Loomis Method in a nutshell. Now something that confused me a lot when originally learning this method, which I'll clear up right now just in case, is that the horizontal line isn't actually meant to indicate where the eyes are supposed to go. They're actually the brow line. And from the brow line you can just sketch out the indication of the eye sockets, which for some might make the process of placing the eyes a little more easy. And with the Loomis Method more or less down, I practiced it a little bit more from a couple different angles before moving on to something a little bit harder. So next up I decided to try out the very popular learning method of copy drawing, where you choose a piece of art you really like and try to replicate and break it down, with the intention of getting a deeper understanding behind the methodologies and techniques of the artist you copy. This isn't really a method too unfamiliar to me, as my two previous videos are based around using this method to learn and break down the styles of the artists I really enjoy. But for this video I decided that I wanted to simplify the process a little bit, so I used the Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3 character sheets included in their respective art books, and just tried my best to break down each expression and facial proportion I chose to draw. As a foundation, I decided to continue using the Loomis Method, as I personally found that to be the most reliable way of drawing consistently decent heads. So I would basically just start off with a more rough sketch, with the purpose of mapping out the approximate location of the facial features. Then I do another iteration on top of that again, focusing more on details before finally moving on to the hair. I found this to be a really effective workflow for getting a feel for the artist style, without having to spend too much time on each study. One thing I noticed while drawing these heads, however, was that the Loomis Method for me generally tended to make the heads a bit too wide, meaning I'd constantly have to adjust the scale horizontally to match the references better. So I might be using the method a bit wrong, so let me know in the comments what I could improve on. Anyways, after doing 3 faces, I decided to try and draw my own 3-run face, to apply what I've learned from my previous studies into my own creation. And this time I made sure to keep the head a bit less wide initially, but even so I still had to scale it down a tiny amount later. But all in all, I'm pretty happy with the results, but I still struggled a lot with one thing, which was the eyes. I've always had a really hard time when it comes to visualizing and drawing eyes in different perspectives. The way the eyes bend and the shape change has just never really made intuitive sense to me, which is why I think actually bunkering down and forcing myself to learn how to draw eyes in perspective is probably the most beneficial exercise for me right now. And during this research around how to draw eyes in perspective, I managed to come across this amazing video by the creator Santiago Astor, who gave the idea of dividing the eyes into 3 separate planes, while also showing how these planes would shift in perspective, with each plane getting progressively massively smaller. Something about this explanation and breakdown really made it click for me. And using this method of drawing eyes by breaking the shape of the eye down into planes really helped me more or less just instantly improve my eye perspective drawing skills. So for the next method of practice, we have what some refer to as the blind method, which is a method originally introduced to me by the amazing art channel Oridays, where much like the copy drawing method, you'll take a piece of art you really like and study it. But instead of keeping the reference while you draw, you instead completely remove it while trying to redraw the piece of art purely from your head and what you learned during your initial study of the piece. Then afterwards you'll overlay your attempt to the real art, noting down the things you did differently and trying to figure out why the artist did it the way they did. After that you'll yet again remove the reference piece to try to recreate it a second time, hopefully getting closer and closer to the original with each iteration. After studying a couple of their pieces using this method, you'll naturally start getting a much better understanding of the artist's methodologies and exactly how they prefer doing specific things. I honestly think this might be the best method of practice I've tried so far in this video. And even though I lost the original footage, I ended up drawing this piece of Asaro after a few attempts from my studies, which I think turned out fairly solid. It's time to put everything I've learned during these around 100 hours of practice into one final illustration. I began by using the Loomis Method to sculpt out a head shape I thought could work, after which I tried splitting the eyes into 3 parts again, and following the same principle I went over earlier, I duplicated the eye shape and made it match the perspective better. I unfortunately didn't have a lot of time to practice hair during this challenge, so I just had to kinda slowly and awkwardly improve on it more and more over multiple iterations, each iteration giving the hair some extra detail until it became passable enough. I also decided to just quickly draw her an outfit too, but I'd later scratch this anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Additionally, before moving on to the line art, I roughly colored the sketch in and added a bit of shading, just to get an approximate idea of the direction I wanted to take the final piece. There isn't a ton to comment on during the line art phase, but I did actually use this time to refine and add more details to each element from the sketch. While I normally wouldn't really recommend this approach, it did help me get the line art done a little bit faster at the expense of general line quality. Now for the shading, I wanted to try doing something similar to what the outstanding artist Nardack does. Their art really does an amazing job at conveying shapes while also utilizing super vibrant colors, which makes their pieces pop a ton. So I thought a similar style of shading could work really well with my current line art. But since this video is more so about the fundamentals and structure of the head, I won't go super in depth about the shading. But quickly explain, I basically just used a ton of gradients to create a very soft and pleasant effect across most surfaces. For the eyes, I started by shading the upper part of it with a slightly darker color, then adding another soft, almost completely black layer over that again, before giving the pupil and lower iris a nice glow. Then finally I added some reflections on top of the eyes, along with painting parts of the eyelids with a brown reddish color, also adding yet another reflection on the eyelash itself. And finally for the hair, I added a big light source that wraps around large parts of the hair with a light blue color, which did a really good job at contrasting with the red eye and inner hair. I then added a dark gradient for most of the lower hair, which I used to carve out some shadows with the snap eraser tool, much like I did back in my Persona art style breakdown video. And finally I added yet another even darker shadow on top of that again, keeping in mind the same sharp shape design. And here is the final results of this challenge. I'm actually really happy with how this illustration turned out, despite the hair not being the best. I just really love how the eyes actually seem more 3-dimensional now, compared to how my art used to look like. And I think the shading techniques I picked up from Nardack worked super well here too. So hopefully you were able to pick up some helpful tips from these methods I tried out. Be sure to let me know in the comments what your favorite method covered was, and what you want to see next.